They called it the Dark Ages, an entire chapter of human history painted in shades of shadow, not simply dimmed by time, but erased with intention. According to what we've been taught, this was an age where reason faded, where science slumbered, and where art and innovation simply ceased to breathe. An entire continent, they say, forgot how to dream. But how could that be? How could a people once home to Aristotle, Archimedes, and Cicero suddenly forget to think, to write, to question? And more importantly, who decided to name this era dark in the first place? It wasn't a historian. It wasn't the people who lived through it. The label didn't come from scholars or poets. It came from an institution that rose as Rome crumbled, the church, or more precisely, those who took hold of memory when the empire fell into silence. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, it did not go down in flames with armies and trumpets. There were no speeches, no monuments, no cries of grief. Only a quiet dethroning. A boy emperor named Romulus Augustulus, deposed by a barbarian general. No empire-wide funeral, no public mourning, and stranger still, no detailed record of what followed. You would expect libraries of letters, of scrolls, of eyewitness accounts. Instead, what you find are centuries of fog. From the 5th to the 8th century, Europe fades, chronicles grow thin, stories become whispers. Entire cities seem to stop existing. Not burned, not lost, just paused. As if someone drew a curtain over the past and said, "No further." And behind that curtain, a single power remained standing. Not a general, not an emperor, but the church. With the secular world in ruins, the church didn't simply survive. It grew. It claimed the one thing more powerful than armies or gold. It became the guardian of knowledge, the keeper of memory. Not through violence, but through selection. Not by destroying everything, but by preserving only what served its purpose. Thousands of works, Greek, Latin, Coptic, vanished, burned, hidden, rewritten? No one knows for sure, but what did remain was carefully translated into ecclesiastical Latin, a sacred tongue, taught only to those within the monastery walls, a language of restriction, not revelation. And so the past was sealed. Monks decided which texts were worthy. Religious doctrine colored every translation, and the libraries that once held the wisdom of the ancients now held only scripture, commentary, and silence. For centuries, what Europe knew of its own story was filtered through stained glass and candlelight, not by accident, but by design. And so we ask, was the Dark Ages truly an age of darkness? Or was it an illusion, a veil drawn by those who held the pen, rewriting the past, not with lies, but with omissions? Perhaps history wasn't lost, it was locked away. And if that's the case, then we are left with a far more disturbing question. Not what happened, but who didn't want us to know it happened at all? Let's begin. It wasn't just the buildings that crumbled when Rome fell. It was memory. It was the very mechanism through which a civilization remembers itself. The schools, once vibrant with debate and wonder, closed their gates. The universities, where law and science had once danced side by side with literature and philosophy, fell into silence. Their libraries stood abandoned, their shelves collapsing under dust and ash. And in that silence, someone began to rewrite. But they did not do it with fire and sword. They did it with parchment, with ink, and with time. The task was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. Because in the shadows of monasteries, far from the cities now lost to decay, a new system of preservation took root. A system cloaked in devotion, but pulsing with control. Monks. They are often imagined as gentle keepers of peace, robed men chanting hymns in candlelit stone halls, copying ancient scrolls in careful silence. And they were. But they were also gatekeepers, not only of prayer, but of memory itself. They copied texts, yes, but not all of them. They chose which texts to copy. They chose how to translate. And they chose what not to write at all. Those ancient writings that did not serve the teachings of the church, those that spoke of stars and atoms, republics and revolutions, those that questioned the divine order, were deemed unworthy, heretical, dangerous. Some were buried. Some, perhaps, were burned. But most were simply never copied again. Left to rot. Left to disappear. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but in its place rose a new empire. Not of soldiers, but of scribes. Not of conquest, but of curation. And unlike any empire before it, this one would claim dominion not over land, but over time itself. The Catholic Church, through its network of monastic orders, did more than save knowledge. It repackaged it. It distilled the ancient world into a version that aligned with its vision. Classical Latin, once the language of law, literature, architecture, and astronomy, was replaced with Church Latin, a narrower, more rigid dialect. A language no longer meant to explore, but to obey. The great dialogues of Cicero, the natural philosophies of Aristotle, the mathematical brilliance of Pythagoras, all filtered, trimmed, rewritten, and if any of their works contradicted doctrine, they were not edited, they were erased. This was not ignorance, it was design. A design that ensured only one voice echoed through time. The voice of the church. One narrative, one truth, one version of history. For hundreds of years, Europe's only access to its own past came through the hands of cloistered men working beneath vaulted ceilings. They did not lie. They omitted. They did not debate. They decreed. They did not question. They defined what questions were allowed to be asked. And over time, the questions stopped. A child born in the 7th century would grow up in a world where the stars were not to be studied, but to be feared. Where illness was not to be diagnosed, but prayed over. Where curiosity, once the soul of the ancient world, was now whispered of only in confession. This was not a loss of knowledge. It was the reprogramming of human thought. And the result was silence, a vast, chilling quiet that blanketed a continent. A pause so long and so complete that even now we refer to it as a disappearance. No wars of great note, no buildings of grandeur, no revolutions of science or of spirit, only scripture, and the slow, rhythmic copying of a single story while all others were left to fade. But knowledge does not die easily. It hides. It lingers in the margins. It waits. And eventually, it begins to whisper again. Imagine living within a lie so vast, so perfectly constructed, that even the flow of time itself bends around it. There is a theory, quiet but persistent, born not in the halls of conspiracy, but whispered in academic corners, among those who have spent their lives chasing the puzzle pieces of history. It is called the Phantom Time Hypothesis, and it dares to ask a question almost too large to face. What if entire centuries never happened at all? According to this bold idea, nearly 300 years of European history, from around the year 614 to 911, may have been fabricated, stitched into the calendar not by accident or confusion, but with purpose. Why? To consolidate power, to rewrite legacy, to ensure that kings ruled by divine right, on dates carefully chosen, aligned with prophecy, not fate. And who could carry out such a feat? Only an institution with control, not just over the written word, but over time itself. The Church. More specifically, the early Vatican alongside political allies like Emperor Otto III and the brilliant monk Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II. Together, they possessed the perfect alchemy of influence, religious authority, imperial ambition, and scholarly mastery. They didn't need to forge thousands of years, only a few hundred, enough to push history forward, to shape the present by inserting a past that had never truly occurred. And so, time was rearranged, like pages in a manuscript edited by unseen hands. Of course, such a theory sounds unbelievable, absurd even, until you begin to notice the cracks. Where are the records, the first-hand accounts, the artifacts, the buildings? From the 5th to the 9th century, Europe falls strangely silent. Chronicles grow thin. Events blur or contradict one another. Kings rise and fall, with names that echo past emperors, as if someone were copying a structure but changing the actors. Charlemagne, for example, a figure said to have ruled in the early 9th century, mirrors Constantine the Great of the 4th in almost eerie detail. Both united fractured lands, both reformed laws, both established religious legitimacy through power, one in the name of empire, the other in the name of God, and still, no one questioned it. But the sky never lies. Astronomical records, from ancient China to the Islamic world, align with celestial precision. Solar eclipses, comet paths, planetary cycles. All measurable, all predictable. And yet, when compared to Europe's historical dates, they don't match. Events said to occur during eclipses happened on clear skies. Records of heavenly movements vanish, as if those years had no night sky at all. In a world before digital clocks, the stars were the only truth. So what does it mean when even the stars don't agree with our timeline? It means the calendar may have been adjusted, not just the days or months, but the very numbering of years. It means the medieval world was not just kept in ignorance. It may have been told a false time, and that, perhaps, we are not truly living in the year 2025, but something closer to 1725. If that sounds impossible, remember this. The Gregorian calendar we use today was created by a pope, introduced in 1582. It revised the Julian calendar, removing 10 days from October that year to fix astronomical drift. It seemed like a simple correction, but when time is controlled, even the smallest adjustment can conceal something enormous. Because once you change the measurement of time, you change everything that is built upon it. History, memory, legitimacy, truth. And truth, as we've seen, has always been the most dangerous thing to hide. The Vatican has never officially denied the phantom time hypothesis, nor has it acknowledged it. It remains quiet, and sometimes silence is not absence. It is strategy. When you control knowledge and also time, you need not rewrite everything. You simply preserve what serves your purpose and allow the rest to vanish into the void. Of all the mysteries buried beneath the surface of time, none glows more quietly, more defiantly than the stars. The heavens are incorruptible. They follow no man's orders, no empire's law, no pope's decree. They mark time not in ink or ideology, but in light. A total solar eclipse, a blood moon, a wandering planet in retrograde. These are not matters of belief. They are certainties. They do not ask for permission. They do not forget. They do not lie. And yet, somehow, during Europe's so-called Dark Ages, they too began to vanish. Not from the sky, but from the records. When modern researchers began to overlay celestial data with the historical timeline handed down from European texts, something broke. Astronomical events carefully documented in Greek, Persian, Chinese, and Jewish manuscripts often had no matching entry in Western records. Or worse, events that were said to have occurred under an eclipse took place when no such eclipse ever darkened the sky. These discrepancies were not minor. Not off by a day, not even by a week. They were off by decades. In some cases, centuries. This left researchers with a haunting question. If the stars say one thing and the records say another, then which is the truth? The answer, of course, depends on who was allowed to write it. In medieval Europe, astronomers did not stand apart from religion. They stood beneath it. Their observations were tolerated, but only if they fit within a narrative already sealed. And if they didn't, well, then the sky must be wrong. Or worse, the astronomer must be a heretic. We often forget that the Church once held sway over some of the greatest minds in the cosmos. Men like Galileo, forced to kneel and deny the very orbits he had seen with his own eyes. Or Giordano Bruno, whose belief in infinite worlds and a boundless universe ended in fire, not debate. Centuries before the Vatican formally established its observatory, it had already been watching the stars, not to unlock the universe, but to contain it. Records of eclipses, planetary transits, lunar cycles, all quietly collected, copied, and hidden within private ecclesiastical archives, unpublished, unshared, untouched by science for centuries. A cosmic library where time could be shaped to serve theology. You see, whoever controls the stars controls the calendar. And when you control the calendar, you control when empires rise, when prophecies are fulfilled, when kings are crowned by divine timing. If the church declared that an eclipse marked the beginning of an era, then it must have occurred, even if the sky said otherwise. And if a date did not match the celestial rhythm, then astronomers were asked not to question, but to adjust, not to observe, but to conform. Today, we can reverse engineer the skies with algorithms of stunning precision. We can know when and where an eclipse appeared 1,000 years ago, to the minute. And yet, the deeper we look, the more the timeline we inherited begins to unravel. So much doesn't add up. The stars say one thing, history says another, and between them stands the quiet figure of the church, holding the clock in one hand and a key in the other. That key is not just to knowledge, it's to time itself, to a history rearranged, to a past where the sky was censored, to a world where the truth had to orbit around the pulpit, because in that age, it wasn't science that was feared, it was certainty. And the heavens, so certain, so unchanging, were simply too dangerous to be left unedited. There are stories we're told as children that after Rome fell, Europe wandered in confusion, that people forgot how to build roads, forgot how to chart the seas, forgot the shape of the very world they lived in. And yet, there are maps so old, so accurate, so impossible to explain that they seem to whisper through the parchment. We knew more, much more. Take the Piri-Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. This fragment of cartographic history depicts the west coast of Africa, the eastern shores of South America, and something else, something truly puzzling: the coastline of Antarctica. Not as it appears today, buried beneath endless sheets of ice, but as it would look if stripped bare, revealing the rock contours underneath. A view we didn't confirm until satellites scanned it in the 20th century. How? How could a man in the early 1500s possess data that shouldn't have existed until modern imaging? He claimed the map was not his own, that it was compiled using older source maps, fragments passed down from civilizations long gone, their origins unknown, their creators unnamed. This is not an isolated case. Across Europe and beyond, scattered among forgotten libraries and private collections, there are other maps that defy their time. Maps showing the Americas before Columbus. Maps depicting longitude with eerie precision, a mathematical feat believed impossible before the invention of the marine chronometer. Maps that include islands which have long since disappeared beneath the waves, or perhaps never existed at all. Each one raises the same unsettling question: where did this knowledge come from, and why did it vanish? Historians have long struggled to explain these anomalies. Some call them accidents, others frauds, but a growing number of researchers believe they point to something more chilling: a hidden chain of knowledge, a suppressed lineage of discovery cut short by an institution determined to rewrite the story of the world. And where do these researchers all point? To the same locked door: the Vatican. Deep Deep beneath Vatican City, far from the golden domes and crowded chapels, lies a vault, the Vatican Secret Archive, a private repository containing miles of shelving, over 1,000 years' worth of documents, maps, letters, and records that the public will never see. It is there, many believe, that the missing maps sleep. The source documents, the original geometries, the fragments of ancient worlds that were once charted and then deliberately concealed. Less than 1% of this vast collection has ever been released. The rest remains sealed, unsearchable, uncatalogued, and utterly off-limits. Why? What is it that needs protecting so fiercely? Are these maps just drawings? Or are they confessions? Confessions that the world was never as dark, as lost, as ignorant as we've been led to believe, because if Europe knew more, if it had access to ancient navigation systems, pre-modern global understanding, knowledge of coastlines untouched by European feet for centuries, then the entire premise of the so-called Age of Discovery collapses. It wouldn't have been discovery. It would have been rediscovery, a retrieval of secrets long buried by those who once held the light but decided to turn it off. Maps are more than tools of direction. They are declarations. They define borders, name territories, claim worlds. And when you erase a map, or hide one, you don't just lose geography. You lose memory. You lose proof that someone once stood there, measured that distance, drew that curve of coastline when they weren't supposed to know it existed. If you don't know where you are, you can be led anywhere. That is the danger. And for centuries, the Vatican has quietly held that compass, not just of faith, but of the earth itself. They do not need to erase. They simply withhold. And when maps disappear, history stops being a journey and becomes a maze, one where the path has been redrawn by hands unseen. They say Europe forgot how to build, that after the fall of Rome, the ancient knowledge of design, of engineering, of power over stone and water simply vanished. That people wandered among ruins they no longer understood, like ghosts of a once great civilization haunting their own forgotten brilliance. And yet, in fields, in ruins, in quiet valleys untouched by war, something strange has been found. Remnants of gears, bronze wheels with mathematical precision, vaults designed to resist gravity, geothermal heating systems that hum silently beneath medieval Earth, and all of them dated squarely within the time we've been told was soaked in ignorance. In the countryside of Germany, a series of intricate bronze mechanisms were unearthed, crafted not by ancient Rome, but during the very period we were taught Europe had lost its way. Not simple tools, not toys, but devices that suggest an understanding of ratios, leverage, and timing far beyond what any textbook would assign to that age. Elsewhere, in forgotten monasteries, buried beneath stone and moss, archaeologists have found astronomical instruments, delicate, calibrated, designed to trace the movement of the stars with a level of accuracy that should not have existed until centuries later. In remote alpine villages, there are heating systems, networks of stone tunnels and steam vents that kept entire communities warm through brutal winters, built without blueprints, without modern science, without permission from history. So how do we explain these things? How do we reconcile invention with an era that was supposedly void of innovation. Mainstream historians call them anomalies, outliers, isolated sparks in a cold, dark world. But what if they are not accidents? What if they are echoes of knowledge never truly lost, only silenced? Silenced by control. Because here is the part we are not told. Many of the lands where these discoveries were made once belonged to the church. And in these regions, any excavation, any archaeological study requires not only the approval of local authorities, but the quiet consent of the Vatican. It is the gatekeeper, not just of faith, but of the earth beneath your feet. And when something is found that doesn't fit the timeline, that questions the accepted narrative, it is quietly removed for preservation. It vanishes from the public eye, and in its place, a story is told. A story of superstition, of simplicity, of peasants and prayer and plagues. A story where the only light comes from the pulpit, not from invention. A few independent archaeologists have spoken out. They've shared accounts of findings that disappeared overnight, of documents they were no longer allowed to publish, of funding that dried up the moment their discoveries strayed from the expected script. And when they persisted, they were dismissed, labeled conspiracy theorists, banished from academia. Because in history, truth is not always welcome, especially when it comes too early. So we must ask, did Europe truly fall into darkness? Or was a veil simply drawn over its achievements? If people believed they were ignorant, they would never ask how they once built aqueducts. If they thought they were primitive, they'd never question how someone charted the stars in a cloister lost to time. If they believed their ancestors knew nothing, they'd never search for the remnants of what they once knew. And so silence becomes protection. Not for the people, but for the narrative. You don't need to destroy knowledge if you can delay it. You don't need to burn blueprints if no one knows how to read them. You don't need chains if generations grow up in cages they believe are temples. This is not the absence of memory. It is the shaping of it. And beneath that silence, beneath the fields and stones and fading monasteries, the inventions still lie waiting. Not dead, just forgotten. We often imagine loss as a single devastating event. A fire that consumes, a war that shatters, a collapse that silences. But what if the greatest loss in human history was not caused by destruction, but by delay? What if knowledge did not vanish in flames, but was placed gently on a shelf, just out of reach, and left there for centuries? There is a myth, we are taught, that innovation vanished for nearly 1,000 years, and then, suddenly, as if struck by lightning, human brilliance erupted again during the Renaissance. But the truth, if we dare to look closer, is far more unsettling. Because in those quiet, in-between centuries, something was happening. Or rather, something wasn't. Ideas weren't lost. They were stalled. Not burned, but buried, preserved like seeds beneath cold stone. Waiting, but never allowed to bloom. And who held the key to that slow-blooming vault? The same hands that held the scriptures, the same voices that whispered from the pulpit, the same institution that decided what was heresy and what was divine. The church, more specifically, the Vatican. It was not that the Church destroyed all knowledge. That would have been too obvious, too irreversible. Instead, it preserved only what served the faith and sealed away the rest. Ancient manuscripts, philosophical treatises, scientific diagrams, mathematical theorems, hidden in monastery vaults, copied in secret, restricted by language, and guarded by men trained not to question, but to obey. And when the time came, when the Church decided the world was ready, those ideas were released, one by one, as if rediscovered, as if born anew. A rotating shaft, a technology known to the Greeks, reappears in the 13th century. Anatomical sketches echoing Galen, surfacing again in the Renaissance. Concepts of heliocentricity, planetary motion, natural philosophy, all of them returning, not as preserved knowledge, but as miraculous genius, as if humanity had taken a 1,000-year nap, only to awaken brilliant once more. But the nap was not a slumber. It was sedation, administered slowly, lovingly, through control. Imagine a society where the only book you're allowed to read is the Bible, where the only questions you're permitted to ask are about heaven and hell, where wonder is replaced by worship, and imagination is policed. In such a world, science does not disappear. It waits, and when it finally returns, it arrives dressed in robes of obedience. The Vatican didn't need to erase progress. It only needed to pace it, to slow it, to decide when the world would be allowed to know, and when it would remain in quiet reverence. A delay of knowledge is not a pause in time. It is a redirection of destiny. Because when people do not know what once was, they do not know what could be. They stop asking. They stop reaching. They forget that stars were once charted, that blood was once understood, that machines once turned without divine permission. In this way, the Vatican became more than a spiritual authority. It became a metronome, deciding the rhythm of civilization's awakening. And when the world finally stirred, when it opened its eyes and saw again the wonders of science, of mathematics, of engineering, the Church was there, smiling, claiming credit, as if it had never held the curtain closed. But make no mistake, what we call the Renaissance was not a rebirth. It was a carefully timed unveiling, a flickering lantern lit only when the gatekeepers decided the light would no longer burn the eyes of those kept in darkness. A civilization doesn't stall by accident, it stalls by design. And for nearly a millennium, Europe did not forget how to invent. It was simply told, not yet. Far beneath the sunlit courtyards of Vatican City, below the marble basilicas and painted ceilings, there is a door. It is not gilded. It does not appear in tourist guides. It does not swing open with song or prayer. It is locked, tightly, deliberately, permanently. Behind it lies a place known only in whispers, the Vatican Secret Archive, or in its original name, Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. A name heavy with breath and stone, a name that does not mean secret in the modern sense, but rather private. But when what is private includes the past itself, the difference becomes meaningless. This archive is not legend. It is not speculation. It exists, and it is vast. More than 50 kilometers of shelving, over 1 million documents, manuscripts so old their language has no living speaker, letters written by kings, emperors, scientists, and saints, ancient charts, doctrinal edits, histories unspoken. No one outside the church has ever seen it in full. Not a single scholar, not a single pope. No modern map of its interior exists. What is inside? Some say the original unedited Gospels. Others whisper of banned medical texts, of pre-Christian cosmologies, of documents that rewrite the entire timeline of human civilization. Some believe the archive holds proof that knowledge once flourished in the so-called Dark Ages, that breakthroughs we attribute to later centuries were in fact born long before, hidden, then revealed at the church's choosing. Still others believe the archive contains maps, instruments, perhaps even relics of technologies that could dismantle our understanding of ancient capabilities. But no one knows, because this is not a library, it is a vault of silence. To access it, you must first request permission. You must be a scholar of recognized standing. You must name the specific document you wish to read, without knowing what documents are even there. No photocopies, no scanning, no public sharing, no wandering through aisles. You're watched, you're timed, you're allowed inside only as long as they permit. And then you leave, carrying no proof, only memory. And this is how truth is managed, not erased, but caged, not argued, but postponed. Imagine a vault where the fragments of who we truly were are shelved quietly, waiting in perfect condition to never be seen again. Imagine documents that predate not just Christianity, but written history as we know it. Manuscripts inked in extinct tongues, anatomical diagrams that rival modern textbooks, observations of the stars long before Galileo dared to look up, preserved not to be shared, but to be protected. And when something is protected too carefully, it ceases to live. It becomes an artifact, a hostage, a ghost. The Vatican says it does this to preserve sacred knowledge, to guard humanity from confusion, to shield the faithful from dangerous distortions. But the truth does not need protection. It does not wilt beneath sunlight. Only lies do. So what is being shielded? What is so dangerous that even scholars cannot see it? What truth, if released, would ripple across continents and crack the timeline open like thunder? We may never know, because this is not just a physical archive. It is a gate, a border between the world we are allowed to remember and the one we are never meant to. And as long as it stays locked, history remains a story told by candlelight, edited, abridged, sanctioned by those who wear the key. Because the greatest form of censorship is not to burn the book. It is to place it behind a wall so thick, so holy, so island, that no one even remembers to ask for it. Not every book was burned. Some were hidden, some were renamed, and some were quietly erased from the story before it was ever finished. We speak often of the Bible as though it arrived complete, as though one divine hand inscribed its words in a single breath of fire and stone. But that is not what happened. The Bible, as we know it today, is the result of a long and meticulous process, a process of assembly, of selection, of removal. And in that removal, something sacred was lost. Scattered across ancient deserts, sealed within jars and caves, buried beneath crumbling monasteries and hidden in forgotten libraries, there exist gospels, holy writings, that paint a different picture of the divine. They are called the Apocrypha, but that word does not mean false. It means forbidden. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas Iscariot, the Book of Enoch, each of them a window, not into blasphemy, but into a different kind of light. In these texts, Jesus is not a distant, unreachable figure crowned only in cosmic power. He is a teacher, a philosopher, a man who points inward, urging people not to depend solely on the church, but to look within, to seek the divine not in temples or scrolls, but in the soul's quiet awakening. That message was not convenient, because if the sacred was already within you, what need would you have for intermediaries, for priests, for a towering institution to stand between you and God? And so these texts were labeled heresy, not because they were lies, but because they offered too much freedom. They spoke of the feminine divine, of cycles of destruction and rebirth, of civilizations that existed before Adam, and truths that stretched far beyond the narrow corridor of doctrine. Some hinted at beings of light, not angels, not demons, but entities of consciousness, watchers of time. Others suggested that salvation was not something earned through blind obedience, but through awareness. Revolutionary ideas, too revolutionary. The church responded with silence, with fire, with fear. To possess one of these writings was not merely frowned upon. It was a crime, a path to execution. For centuries, men and women were tortured, imprisoned, burned alive, not for what they did, but for what they read. Even monks, those gentle scribes cloistered in silence, sometimes dared to copy the Apocrypha, not to defy the church, but to preserve what their hearts whispered was truth. Hidden in the backs of scrolls, folded between the margins of psalms, smuggled across empires in cloaks and prayer books. They knew these words were not meant to die. And still today, the Vatican refuses to acknowledge these texts as doctrinal. They have been declassified, yes, published by universities, whispered in modern scholarship, but within the halls of the church, they remain unwelcome, unverified, unauthenticated. The official explanation? They do not align with sacred tradition, but tradition is not truth. Tradition is repetition, and sometimes repetition becomes a cage. So we ask, if these writings are harmless, why hide them? If they are lies, why fear them? And if they are simply wrong, why were so many willing to die for them? The answer lies not in doctrine, but in power. Because power is not threatened by falsehoods, it is threatened by alternatives. By choice, by the possibility that the story you've been given is not the only story that was written. And when belief is shaped by only one version of the truth, then to question that version is to awaken, not to rebellion, but to remembering. So tonight, as you drift between sleep and silence, know that somewhere, perhaps deep beneath Vatican stone, these Gospels still exist. They have not been destroyed. They have been delayed. And if one day they are allowed to rise again, it will not be to replace the faith, but to remind it that light never fears more light. Not all wars are fought with armies. Not all battles echo with swords or cannon fire. Some take place in libraries, in minds, in the quiet moments between idea and expression. These are the silent wars, the wars waged against thought. And for over 1,000 years, Europe lived beneath the shadow of one such war. It was not declared, it was imposed. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly, like fog creeping into a valley, until every shape, every landmark vanishes. This was the war on curiosity, and those who dared to fight it, who chose to ask, to challenge, to remember, were branded with one word: heretic. They were not evil. They were not violent. They were thinkers. They were translators, scribes, scholars, astronomers, alchemists. Men and women who saw light where others demanded darkness. And for that, they paid with their lives. The most famous among them was Giordano Bruno, a Dominican friar, a philosopher of the infinite. He believed the universe stretched beyond all reckoning, that countless worlds circled countless stars. He saw no contradiction between science and the divine. He saw wonder in the vastness of creation. But to the Vatican, his wonder was dangerous. He was arrested, tried in silence, and in the year 1600, he was burned alive in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome. Not because he lied, but because he looked up at the stars and refused to lie about what he saw. But Bruno was not alone. Roger Bacon, centuries earlier, began to explore the laws of optics, the mechanics of lenses, and the early seeds of scientific method. He was imprisoned by his own order. Michael Servetus, a physician who challenged the Trinity and explored the circulation of blood, was burned by fire and buried in silence. Thousands of others are not remembered by name because their names were erased. They were monks who copied the wrong scroll, women who healed with herbs and ancient knowledge, men who traced constellations not with superstition, but with calculation. They did not scream. They did not revolt. They simply knew, and that was enough to make them dangerous. The Inquisition, that cold ecclesiastical machine, was not just a tool of fear. It was the most refined mechanism ever created to purge ideas without bloodshed. Though there was plenty of that too. It did not need evidence, only accusation. It did not need justice, only obedience. And as centuries passed, the church learned something even more powerful than force: silence. Because once fear takes root, people begin to censor themselves. They do not need to be told not to speak. They simply learn to remain quiet. Ideas, once silenced, do not always return. And when an entire generation forgets that questioning was once possible, then questioning itself becomes foreign, suspicious, dangerous. In that world, books do not need to be burned. They simply stop being written. This was not the absence of knowledge. It was the sterilization of it, a kind of forced amnesia, a ritual forgetting, a world where to know was to risk your breath, where truth if not blessed, was forbidden. Where the mind bowed before the altar, not in reverence but in submission. And this too was a form of darkness, not the kind that blinds, but the kind that soothes you into sleep while the truth slips from your fingers. The Vatican did not need to kill every thinker, only a few. The rest would learn to fall in line, to wait, to delay. And in that waiting, the light dimmed, not extinguished, but softened until it looked just enough like faith to be mistaken for salvation. Not everyone bowed, not everyone burned, not every voice that carried truth was silenced. Some truths were not shouted in the streets, but whispered in stone, etched in symbols, woven into architecture, hidden beneath the surface of a world taught to forget. These were the keepers of memory, not sanctioned by any church, not recorded in any official book. They lived in the shadows, not to deceive, but to protect. What they preserved was not rebellion, but remembrance. From the ruins of silence rose something subtle. Networks of thinkers, builders, and seekers, bound not by creed, but by a shared knowledge too old, too vast, too sacred to be spoken aloud. They called themselves by many names, though often they used none at all. But we remember them today as the secret societies, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the alchemists, the hidden orders, each different in origin, yet bound by one thread, the belief that truth still lived beneath the veil. Among them, the Freemasons are perhaps the most visible. Originally master builders, stone carvers, cathedral architects, they knew geometry not just as math, but as a language, a sacred code through which creation itself could be read. Their cathedrals, rising across medieval Europe, were not just places of worship. They were repositories, temples of encoded meaning. The spiral, the compass, the golden ratio, the sacred G, standing not just for God, but for geometry, for gnosis, for guidance. Symbols of stars, eyes, keys, and orbs adorned windows and columns, visible to all but understood by few. And then there were the Rosicrucians, a mystical brotherhood wrapped in myth, said to carry ancient wisdom from Egypt, from Babylon, from lands and languages long buried. They spoke in parable, they wrote in metaphor. Their truths were wrapped in layers, not to confuse, but to conceal. Because in an age where questions could cost you your life, truth had to wear a mask. Even the alchemists, so often caricatured as madmen chasing gold from lead, were in truth philosophers, scientists, mystics, men and women of balance, seeking transformation, not just of metal, but of the soul. They believed that hidden in nature was a code, a divine logic, through which one could reach enlightenment, not through ritual sacrifice or ecclesiastical obedience, but through understanding. And so they studied, in silence, in exile, in hidden rooms beneath libraries and gardens, passing knowledge and symbols in art, in architecture. What connected these societies was not rebellion against the church, but resistance against forgetting. They did not seek to destroy the cathedral, only to leave behind markings, quiet signposts for those who would one day awaken. And it worked. Because even now, if you walk the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, and you know how to look, you will see them. Eyes carved into archways, stars aligned along stained glass, pillars that match celestial geometry, blueprints disguised as ornament, messages not written in ink, but in proportion, in shape, in sacred silence. This is how truth survived, in riddles, in ratios, in the private language of those who understood that truth, when spoken to loudly, is often hunted, and so they passed it forward in quiet, in secret, in trust. Because knowledge cannot be unlearned, but it can be protected. Perhaps they knew that the church could erase books, but not symbols, could silence mouths, but not stone. And maybe, just maybe, they believed that one day, when the chains of fear grew thin, and when the mind stirred again from its long sleep, someone would notice, someone would ask, someone would find the key hidden beneath a rose, behind a compass, inside a circle drawn long ago by hands that never forgot. We often imagine ignorance as a void, an absence of learning, a darkness waiting to be filled by light. But what if ignorance was not an accident? What if it was built layer by layer until it resembled truth? What if forgetting was not something that happened, but something that was taught? In the world shaped by the medieval church, knowledge wasn't simply withheld, it was replaced. And in that replacement, a new structure emerged, one where curiosity was not just discouraged, it was punished. One where the very instinct to question was quietly drained from the minds of children before they ever knew it had a name. This was not a time of blank slates. This was a time of scripted thought. Children grew up in a world where the earth was flat, where stars were hung in the sky by divine hands, where history began with Adam and ended with salvation. The universe was 6,000 years old. The sun revolved around the earth. The greatest danger was not error, but asking, because asking meant doubt, and doubt meant heresy. And so, education itself was rewritten. It was no longer a path to discovery, but a path to obedience. You learned to memorize, not to think, to recite, not to understand, to believe before you could question, and to fear what lived outside the limits of your lesson. In church-run schools, which were nearly all schools, lessons were sermons. Facts were filtered. Entire civilizations, Greek, Egyptian, Islamic, Chinese, were erased or vilified. Even within the cloisters of monastic learning, many monks were only permitted to study fragments of the Bible. The rest was sealed away, too sacred, too dangerous, too true. This was not just control of content, it was the reprogramming of perception. In such a world, truth became a cage, and the mind, its most obedient prisoner. They told you the world had always been this way, that nothing had been lost, that progress began with them, and only through them, that all knowledge flowed downward from the pulpit to the pews, from the cross to the child, and when every question leads back to the same altar, you forget how to question at all. That is the true horror of engineered ignorance. It does not feel like suppression. It feels like tradition, like faith, like safety. But what it really is permission. A carefully administered permission to think only what you are told is thinkable. Over generations, the fog deepened, until one day, people no longer needed to be silenced. They silenced themselves. Not out of fear, but out of habit. And so, an entire continent wandered through history with eyes half closed, never realizing they were walking through ruins of thought they had once built themselves. Ignorance had become culture, and within that culture, the one who dared to see, to truly see, was not seen as wise, but as dangerous. And the strangest, most tragic part? When you grow up inside a prison, you were told was a school. You never try to escape, because you think the walls are there to protect you, not to contain you. Once a lie is told long enough, it no longer needs to be repeated. It begins to live on its own, in the spaces between words, in the quiet assumptions we never question. That's the most effective kind of myth. Not the loud ones, but the ones so familiar. We forget they were ever invented. And so the Dark Ages became a phrase no one needed to explain, because we all thought we already knew what it meant. We imagined muddy roads, crumbling castles, peasants in rags, eyes cast downward. No books, no light, no dreaming. Just plague and piety, superstition and shadow. Where did these images come from? Not from the people who lived through those centuries. Not from the scholars erased from memory. Not from the hidden manuscripts or lost libraries. They came later. In the 19th century, as Europe industrialized and modern nations rose from the embers of empire, a new tool of control emerged. Education. Public school systems began to spread. Millions of children were handed books. Books written by governments, by academies, by clerics and historians who had inherited a story that served them well. And in those books, history was neatly ordered. Ancient Greece, Rome, 1,000 years of darkness. Then the Renaissance. Then the Enlightenment. Then us. It made a beautiful timeline, linear, simple, memorable. But it was never that clean. The myth of the Dark Ages wasn't a description. It was a design, a narrative chosen to elevate the present by casting the past into shadow. Because if those centuries were empty, then whatever came next, whatever progress we claimed, would shine even brighter by contrast. The darkness made the light look divine. And so, generations were taught not to ask what happened during that long silence, but to assume nothing did. No art, no science, no ideas, no resistance, just dormancy, just dust. But textbooks were only the beginning. In the 20th century, the myth took on a new form, one more powerful than any classroom: the screen. Cinema became the modern cathedral, and from Hollywood to Europe's art house films, the image was repeated again and again. Gray skies, miserable towns, priests in dark robes, torture chambers, ignorance, fear, and somewhere in the background, the church. Often brutal, but always the only source of knowledge left standing. No mention of the silent scholars. No hint of secret societies. No acknowledgement of Arab scientists, Chinese inventors, Indian mathematicians who lit the world while Europe was said to sleep. They were cut from the frame because the myth had already been written, and now it was being performed. The more you see something, the less you question it. And when your education and your entertainment say the same thing, you begin to believe it not just with your mind, but with your senses. You feel it. And that feeling, that emotional certainty, is the hardest illusion to break. Try telling someone that the Dark Ages weren't truly dark, that great works were created, that ideas were born and buried, that technology pulsed just beneath the surface. They'll hesitate. Not because they've read the history, but because they've seen the movies. And the movie never lies. This is how memory is controlled. Not just with censorship, but with story. You don't need to hide the past if you can convince people it was never worth remembering. And that is exactly what was done. In the end, the myth of the Dark Ages became more than a narrative. It became a lens, one that continues to distort everything behind it. Even today, we pass this story forward to students, to viewers, to children drawing castles with dragons and dirt roads. We think we're teaching history, but we're really just repeating the script. And somewhere in that repetition, the truth is lost again. Not burned, not buried, just replaced with something easier to believe. Not all prisons have bars. Some are bound in leather, stamped in gold, shelved behind doors that never open. And not every execution requires a blade. Some deaths are quieter, the silencing of an idea, the burial of a question, the erasure of a page. For centuries, there existed a list longer than any sermon, more terrifying than any dungeon. It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. It began in 1559, but its spirit is far older. It stretched back to the days when the church first realized that ideas could be more dangerous than weapons. And so it became necessary to choose which ideas would be allowed to live. The Index wasn't just a blacklist. It was a roadmap of fear. Inside it were names: Galileo, Descartes, Copernicus, Bruno. Books of astronomy, of anatomy, of philosophy. Books that spoke of other worlds, other ways to think, other versions of truth. Books that didn't deny God, but dared to imagine he might be bigger than what had been written. Some of these books were banned for doubting church doctrine, others for suggesting that the universe might not revolve around Earth. Still others were silenced for implying that the soul could reach salvation without intermediaries. Each entry was a warning, not just to readers, but to writers. Because once your name appeared on the Index, you were no longer a thinker, you were a threat. For over 400 years, this list was enforced. And though it was formally abolished in 1966, its impact remains. Because the books themselves, the ideas within them, were never truly released. Most remain tucked away, labeled as irrelevant, outdated, heretical, or misleading. Some exist only in partial translations. Others survive only in whisper, preserved by those who read them in secret, beneath lamplight, outside the walls of sanctioned thought. The church says it banned these books to protect the faithful, to prevent confusion, to guard souls from error. But truth does not fear confusion. It does not fear contradiction. It does not hide behind locked shelves. Only power does. Even today, many of the most controversial texts from history have never been made public. Some are still sealed inside the Vatican archives. Some were lost. Some were preserved, which is just another word for removed from reach. And so, a quiet question remains. What else was written that we were never allowed to read? What other interpretations of science, of spirit, of humanity were stamped out before they had a chance to spread? It is easy to picture flames and inquisitions, but censorship doesn't always wear robes or carry torches. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it uses a stamp. Sometimes it creates systems where access is so difficult, so delayed, that no one even tries. And the most chilling part of all? You don't need to destroy a book if no one ever reads it. In modern times, we pride ourselves on open knowledge, on access, on the illusion that all truths are now free. But even now, there are libraries within libraries, collections behind passwords and permissions, where the past still hides from the present, and when the very institution that claims to hold moral authority controls not only scripture, but also the memory of all other possibilities, then silence is no longer an accident. It becomes a tool. So the next time you open a book, remember this. It is not only what you are reading that shapes your mind. It is what you are not allowed to read. The unwritten chapters, the forbidden pages, the stories that never saw the light of day. Because censorship is not always about erasing what exists. Sometimes it's about making sure you never know what you're missing. What if we are living in a story not of what happened, but of what was chosen to be told? What if the calendar itself, the ticking rhythm of time, was shaped by human hands, guided by agendas, blessed by ceremony, and locked by tradition? What if the timeline we inherit, from Rome to Renaissance, from darkness to light, was a carefully arranged theater set with missing acts and rewritten scripts? One of the most unsettling ideas in modern historiography is not that history has gaps, but that some of those gaps were never meant to be filled. That certain events, certain people, certain whole centuries may not have happened in the way we think they did. Some researchers believe nearly 300 years of medieval European history were artificially inserted, fabricated to stretch time, legitimize thrones, and align prophecy with power. A theory called the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests we may not be living in the year 2025, but something closer to 1725. Absurd? Perhaps. But then we must ask, why do so many records from that inserted time fail to align with astronomical data? Why do eclipses not match up with recorded dates? Why do some rulers seem to repeat under different names? Why do so many inventions, rediscovered centuries later, mirror ancient knowledge that supposedly vanished? And more haunting still, why does the silence of those centuries feel so complete? Because silence, when applied with precision, doesn't just hide the truth. It replaces it. It smooths the edges. It simplifies the past. And in that simplification, a cleaner, more manageable narrative emerges. One that's easier to teach, easier to remember and far easier to control. In this version of history, truth doesn't disappear in flames. It dissolves beneath repetition. It is not that we are forbidden to ask questions. It is that we no longer know which questions exist. And so we recite. We remember. We believe. We fall asleep in the soft dream of certainty. But sometimes, if you look closely, in the quiet corners of memory, in the seams between centuries, you find a crack, just a sliver, a whisper, a name that shouldn't exist, a star that rises on the wrong date, a map drawn before its time, and in that moment, you begin to wonder. Not what happened, but who told this story? And why was it told this way? Because once history is edited, it is no longer a record. It is a script. And the actors, if they forget they are on a stage, play their parts forever. So where does that leave us? Perhaps not in certainty, but in something better. In wonder. In possibility. In the quiet power of asking. Because questions are where history begins again. Maybe this is why secret manuscripts were hidden, why timelines were blurred, why forbidden books were never burned, only sealed. Because the truth was never truly dead. It was only waiting for someone to remember it. So, if you've listened this far, if you've wandered through the cathedrals of silence, the tunnels of missing time, the libraries of sealed knowledge, then you've already taken the first step. You've asked a forbidden question. You've remembered that remembering is a choice. And in that remembering, there is light. Not blinding, not loud, just a soft, ancient glow beneath the dust. Enough to show that maybe the dark ages weren't dark at all. They were dimmed. And now, perhaps, the light is returning.